few months ago, I did some videos spotlighting different draft classes. We've talked about the 2022 quarterback class, the 2017 class, the 2021 class, and it's all been for the quarterback position, but there was no wide receiver class that was worse than 2017. Guys like John Ross and Corey Davis were supposed to be future franchise players, and supposedly the bottom of the first and second round was also supposed to be full of stars. Instead, now that we flash forward 7 years, the 2017 wide receiver class has been awful. Today, we're to go through all the receivers that were drafted in the top 3 rounds, go through who they were, how their careers have turned out, and overall, you'll get a look at how the class ended up going. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about the 2017 wide receiver class. So, the first guy we need to talk about is Amara Darboh. He had one of the coolest stories in the 2017 NFL Draft. He was from Sierra Leone and fled to Iowa at the age of 7 to escape civil war. This would end up leaving him as an orphan, but he fell in love at football and ended up signing with the Michigan Wolverines after blowing up in high school. He became a second-team All-Big Ten selection in 2016 and ranked 4th in the conference in reception yards per game. Given both his production and his size at 6'2", the Seahawks made him their last pick in the 3rd round, with pick number 106 overall. Sadly, he did not spend much time with the Seahawks though, as he played in every game his rookie season, but only ended up catching 8 passes for 71 yards and no touchdowns. He was cut from the team to start the season in 2018 and then didn't even make their practice squad. Instead, he was briefly claimed by the Patriots, but failed their physical, so he went back to the Seahawks on their practice squad. He was then cut before the start of the 2019 season and signed with the Buccaneers practice squad. Then, he was elevated to their active roster midway through the year and did not record any stats and was cut a few weeks later. After that, he spent time with Pittsburgh practice squad and then a few weeks on their active roster in 2019. But, long story short, he's been back and forth between a couple other practice squads, and in 2021, he washed out entirely. Kinda sad. Up next, the guy we need to talk about is a receiver from Grambling State by the name of Chad Williams. I didn't know much about him before making this video, but he put up huge numbers in the SWAC conference. He ended up catching 90 passes for 1,337 yards and 11 touchdowns during his senior year in 2016. He had one game against Arkansas Pine Bluff, in which he had 236 receiving yards, which was one of 7 games where he had over 100 yards receiving. He ended up getting drafted by the Arizona Cardinals in the 3rd round and went with pick number 98. He was stuck pretty far down the depth chart in Arizona though, and only caught 3 passes for 31 yards as a rookie. He made more of an impact the following season in 2018, catching 5 passes for 51 yards in week 1 against the Seahawks, and then catching his first career touchdown later in the season, also against the Seahawks. In total, he finished with 17 catches and just that 1 touchdown. It wasn't good enough for him to stay around the next year, and then was cut in the 2019 preseason. From there, he signed to the Colts practice squad and then was promoted to their active roster in December, but only spent 1 day before apparently getting injured and released on an injury settlement. He then spent 2020 with 2 separate stints on the Chiefs practice squad, but then was released during 2021. After that, he ended up on the New Orleans Breakers in 2022 and the Arlington Renegades of the XFL after that. Sadly, he won't be making an NFL comeback anytime soon, and Chad Williams is an interesting story. Up next from the draft, we have to talk about Kenny Golladay. He was a dominant receiver in the MAC for Northern Illinois, as he used his 6'5" frame to put up 2 straight 1,000-yard seasons with 10 and 8 touchdowns respectively. After transferring in from North Dakota, he became one of the best receivers in school history for the Huskies. He was then picked in the 3rd round by the Detroit Lions and went number 96 overall. He then proceeded to have one of the weirdest careers, as he made the 3rd receiver spot behind Golden Tate and Marvin Jones, but then made an impact with an early 2-touchdown game against the Cardinals. He then would miss 5 games with a hamstring injury, but managed to put up 477 yards with 28 receptions and 3 touchdowns in 5 total starts. In 2018, he became the Lions' number 1 receiver, catching 70 passes for 1,063 yards and 5 scores under Matt Patricia. He was a nearly unstoppable red zone threat in 2019, using his massive frame to haul in over 1,200 yards and a league-leading 11 touchdowns. He'd go from a dominant receiver to a mid one the next year, as he only put up 300 yards and 2 scores before an injury to his hip, and then he'd miss the rest of 2020. In 2021, he signed a massive deal with the Giants to be their number 1 receiver, but he proceeded to be average at best and only put up 500 yards. His production was so bad in 2022 that he only had 4 total catches by the time week 13 had come around, and he didn't score his first touchdown until week 18. They then cut him at the end of 2022, and his contract with the Giants has been called one of the worst free agency signings in NFL history. He didn't play football at all in 2023, and it's presumed he's done. Up next, we have Chris Godwin. He was kind of a diamond in the rough prospect in the 2017 NFL Draft, and even with Kupp going in the same round, he was still a gem. He finished his 3-year career at Penn State with nearly 2,400 yards and 18 touchdowns before he would declare at the draft. He was one of the stars of the Combine and was then selected by the Buccaneers with the 84th overall pick in the 3rd round. He was stuck behind Deshaun Jackson and Mike Evans on the depth chart, but then worked his way up and found the football field in the back half of the year. In total, he finished with 525 yards and a touchdown on 34 receptions. He solidified himself as a starting receiver in 2018, catching 59 passes for 842 yards and 7 touchdowns before making the Pro Bowl in 2019 on the back of a 1,300-yard, 9-touchdown season, making him one of the top wideouts in the NFL. He then switched his jersey number from 12 to 14 to accommodate for Tom Brady joining the team in 2020. Despite missing a few games with injury, he finished with 840 yards and 12 touchdowns and a Super Bowl victory. From there, the Bucs would franchise tag him in 2021, where he finished with 1,100 yards and 5 touchdowns before he tore his ACL. The next year, they signed him to a 3-year extension, and he put up 2 more 1,000-plus yard seasons with 2 and 3 touchdowns in 2022 and 2023, proving he's one of the league's best wideouts. Another guy I didn't really know much about was Carlos Henderson. He was one of the more talented receivers in Conference USA for Louisiana Tech, finishing his 3-year career with the Bulldogs with 147 catches for 2,800 yards and 28 touchdowns. Back in 2016, he was named the Conference USA Offensive and Special Teams Player of the Year and was a first-team All-Conference pick as well. He decided to skip his senior year and declare for the draft. Tons of scouts thought he'd be a hidden gem, and the Denver Broncos agreed. They selected him with the 82nd overall pick in the 3rd round, but before the season could even start, he was hit with a thumb injury that required surgery, forcing him to sit out his whole rookie year on IR. He started 2018 by not reporting to minicamp due to a personal matter, and was suspended for a substance abuse policy violation before that. He was then cut and signed to the practice squad, and was released from there before he signed with Washington's practice squad, but didn't make the roster and was out of the NFL by 2019. He did end up playing for the Rough Riders in the CFL in 2021, but was released before the season began, and ended up with the Birmingham Stallions in the USFL. But even there, he was moved to their inactive roster, and was out of football by June. Up next, we have to talk about Ardarius Stewart. He was a supplemental receiver in Alabama's offense in 2016, as he caught 54 passes for 864 yards and 9 touchdowns. The previous year, he had 700 yards and 4 scores, so it was clear that he was a solid receiver, but nobody really knew how good he could be at the NFL level. He declared for the NFL Draft as a junior, despite being a pretty unknown product. Scouts did love his size and speed though, and he was selected by the New York Jets with the 79th overall pick in the 3rd round. He ended up playing in 15 games as a rookie for the Jets, but did not get the type of production he was looking for. He only caught 6 passes for 82 yards. He's then suspended for the start of the next year for substance abuse and was signed to the Jets practice squad. He would spend all of 2018 there, and that would be the future for Stewart in the league. He was signed to the Raiders practice squad, the Washington Redskins practice squad, and then in 2019, he was out of the league before he signed with the Blue Bombers of the CFL. He didn't record any stats with Winnipeg and was briefly signed by the BC Lions for a few months before he was released from there. He then went to the DC Defenders of the XFL, but was released from the roster before the season even started. Taiwan Taylor was a record-breaking receiver at Western Kentucky, setting records for receptions, yards, and touchdowns his junior year, and then broke them again his senior year. He finished with a total of 4,234 yards and 41 touchdowns, and was said to be the sleeper pick of the draft. The Titans picked him with the 72nd overall pick in the 3rd round, and he would join Corey Davis, but unfortunately, he couldn't keep up his college production. During his rookie season, he caught 16 balls for 231 yards and also had a touchdown. The next year in 2018, he caught 466 yards and 1 touchdown and 37 catches, but after the season was over, he was traded to the Cleveland Browns. With Cleveland in 2019, he only played in 3 games, recording no receiving stats but did have 3 kick returns. He was then cut and put on the practice squad in 2020. He didn't have any receiving stats that year either, and then signed with the Texans in 2021, but was placed on IR, and by that point, he was out of the NFL. He was then selected in the 16th round of the new USFL, and he would go over to the New Orleans Breakers. He was then transferred to their practice squad before he was elevated back to their active roster, and even in the USFL, he didn't make much of an impact, just catching a total of 24 passes and not a single touchdown. Kupp is the most successful receiver from this class, as he came from a small school in FCS Eastern Washington, but then rose up draft boards after dominating the FCS with multiple awards and a total of nearly 7,000 receiving yards and 73 touchdowns, which led all divisions of the NCAA. Despite this and a great Senior Bowl, scouts didn't think he was worthy of a first-round pick, and he fell to the Los Angeles Rams with the 69th overall pick in the 3rd round. He instantly carved a role for himself in the red zone with the Rams, and by the end of the year, he was their number 1 wideout. He ended his rookie year with 62 catches for 869 yards and 5 touchdowns, and followed up his 2017 season with a 566-yard, 6-touchdown season, but it was cut short due to leg injuries. Then in 2019, he exploded for 94 catches and 1,161 yards and 10 scores, solidifying himself as one of the league's best receivers. He then had another knee injury in 2020, but still put up 974 yards and 3 touchdowns in 15 games, and had his best overall season in 2021, in which he won the Triple Crown of receptions, yards, and touchdowns with 145, 1,947, and 16. He also set a ton of Rams records, but since then he has been injured but still put up decent stats, and he's the best receiver in this class. Up next we have another interesting one, and that is JuJu Smith-Schuster. He's one of the more interesting characters of the 2017 class, known for his TikTok dances while he was in Pittsburgh, and he was an impact player at USC. He was eventually selected by the Steelers with the 62nd overall pick in the 2nd round, and he was the youngest player in the NFL at the time. He was the first guy since 1964 to score at his age, but he blew up that season as a very productive receiver for the Steelers, catching 58 passes for 917 yards and 7 scores. The next year in 2018, it looked like JuJu was going to be one of the new faces of the league, as he was the number 1 slot receiver in Pittsburgh, and he played alongside Antonio Brown and had a career best 111 catches for 1,426 yards and 7 scores. He then took a huge step back in 2019 with just under 600 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. In 2020, his online personality started to get him in trouble, as teams would cite his TikToks as reasons why they wanted to beat the Steelers. He still finished the year with 831 receiving yards and 9 total touchdowns. He hurt himself in Week 5 of 2021 and didn't play again until the playoffs, where the Steelers lost to the Chiefs. He then signed with the Chiefs in 2022, won a Super Bowl with them, and had his best season in years with 78 catches for 933 yards and 3 scores. He had a bad season with New England this last year though, as he only had 260 yards, and JuJu is just an interesting case. Curtis Samuel has a crazy story, as he started out as a running back at Ohio State, but moved around a lot and did a lot of damage at receiver. Eventually, NFL scouts projected he should be an NFL receiver, and he decided to make that switch for good. He ended up being taken with the 40th overall pick by the Carolina Panthers, but was injured halfway through his rookie year and needed season-ending ankle surgery. He only finished with 115 receiving yards and 64 rushing yards in 9 games, and then in 2018, he looked a little better, catching 39 passes for 500 yards and 5 touchdowns, while also running for 84 yards and 2 scores. The next year, he caught 54 passes for 627 yards and 6 touchdowns, while adding 1 more on the ground. 2020 was his best season in Carolina, as he had multiple 100-plus yard games and finished with 77 catches for 851 yards and 3 touchdowns through the air. He also had 200 yards and 2 scores on the ground, and in free agency, he decided to sign with the Washington Commanders, reuniting with Terry McLaurin. But he hurt himself before the season even started and stayed on IR for most of the year, only catching 6 passes. In 2022, he was a secondary receiver in the offense, but still caught 64 passes for 656 yards and 4 scores. He also ran the ball, and last year, he ended up having 62 catches for 613 yards and 4 touchdowns, and he has now decided to sign with the New York Giants. He is an interesting case. These top 3 rounds were really loaded with group of 5 players, as Zay Jones is one of the most productive wide receivers in NCAA history, as he was the all-time receptions leader with 399, and the single-season NCAA receptions leader with 158. He ended up playing for the East Carolina Pirates, and was eventually taken by the Buffalo Bills in the 2nd round. Despite pre-scouts agreeing that he was the 4th best receiver in the draft class, he only started 10 games as a rookie and finished with 316 yards and 2 touchdowns. After the season, it was revealed that he played with a torn labrum and he missed training camp for surgery. The Bills then added Josh Allen that offseason, and Zay was his leading receiver in 2018 with 56 catches for 652 yards and 7 scores. In 2019, he was traded to the Raiders halfway through the year for a 5th round pick and only caught 27 passes. He then sort of became an off-the-bench receiver for the rest of his career, as he only started 2 games for Vegas in 2020, catching 14 passes. In 2021, he caught 47 passes for 500 yards and a touchdown, but they didn't re-sign him, and then he went to the Jags. From there, he had the best season of his career, catching 82 passes for 823 yards and 5 touchdowns. Last year, he had 34 catches for 300 yards, and has since been signed by the Cardinals for the next year. We now get to the final 3, and John Ross is one of the biggest busts in the entire class, if not NFL history. He was an average receiver at best his first 2 years of college at Washington, and then was hurt in 2015. He then exploded onto the scene in 2016, and due to his insane speed and Washington's offense utilizing the deep ball, his stock would go through the roof, and then went nuts after he had a record-setting 40 time at the NFL Combine. Scouts fell in love with John Ross, and the Bengals liked him enough to take him 9th overall. This was a receiver room that really was just AJ Green, and it looked like he would make a huge impact. But in his debut in week 2, he only got 1 touch and fumbled after gaining 12 yards. He'd be active on the roster for 2 out of the next 10 games and didn't record any more stats for the rest of the year. He was instantly seen as one of the biggest busts in modern draft history, and while he marginally improved in 2018 with 21 catches for 210 yards and 7 touchdowns, it still wasn't the type of production people were expecting him to have. To start out 2019, he caught 7 passes for 158 yards against Seattle, and then 4 for 112 against the Niners, but then went back to IR for a shoulder injury and finished 2019 with just 500 yards and 3 touchdowns. The Bengals denied his 5th-year option in 2020, and he requested a trade, but nobody wanted him. He then bounced around the league a bit before he signed with the Giants in 2021 and was on the Chiefs practice squad in 2023 before he retired. John Ross deserves his own video at some point, and I feel bad for him. The second best receiver drafted was Mike Williams. He was one of the top prospects coming out of Clemson, and in his 4 years for the Tigers, he had 2,700 yards and 21 touchdowns, with 11 of those coming his senior year. Unfortunately, a neck injury would linger during his junior campaign, but the Chargers still saw enough in him after his fantastic senior year to take him with the 7th overall pick in the draft. He ended up missing minicamp with a back injury, and that would become a theme for him throughout his career. He was healthy enough to play in week 6, but was hurt again in week 12 against the Cowboys with a knee injury, meaning his rookie season, he only caught 11 passes in 10 games. In 2018, he was finally able to play a full year, starting 5 games, and he had 43 catches for 664 yards and a career-high 10 scores. In 2019, he caught 49 passes and went over the 1,000-yard mark, but still only had 2 touchdowns. In 2020, he caught 48 passes for 756 yards, and by this point, he was stuck behind Keenan Allen as the #1 receiver. Finally, in 2021, he caught a career-high 76 passes for nearly 2,000 yards and 9 touchdowns, fully realizing his potential. He then caught 63 passes for 894 yards and 4 touchdowns in 2022, but suffered a back injury late in the year, and then in 2023, he suffered an ACL tear in week 3. The Chargers decided to release him, and he signed a contract with the New York Jets, so we will see where his career goes from here, and while he's had a couple of bright moments, he's been disappointing compared to where he was drafted. Finally, we get to our last guy on the list, and that is Corey Davis. After going to Western Michigan coming out of Chicago, Corey Davis was seen as one of the best wide receiver prospects in the 2017 NFL Draft. He set school freshman records at Western Michigan in 2013, finishing the year with 67 catches for nearly 1,000 yards. His role in the offense would only increase, and he would finish his time at Western Michigan with an NCAA record for receiving yards with 5,285, and also added 52 touchdowns as well. The Titans ended up making them their first-round pick at number 5 overall, and Corey Davis had a ton of hype. He started in 9 games as a rookie, but battled a hamstring injury that limited his playing time. He finished with a total of 34 catches for 375 yards, but only played in 11 games. In 2018, he played the first full season, catching 65 passes for 891 yards and 4 touchdowns, and he led the Titans in all of those areas. In 2019, he battled injuries again and finished with 600 yards and 2 scores. His best year came in 2020, as he caught 65 passes for 984 yards and 5 scores, but the Titans did not renew his contract. He then signed with the Jets in 2021, but only had 400 yards and 4 touchdowns that year. He followed it up with 500 yards in 2022, and then would decide to retire. He did end up applying for reinstatement, but it's crazy to see a player just not pan out the way he was. So in total, looking back at the class, Corey Davis was a mega bust, Mike Williams was a disappointment, John Ross was a super bust, Zay Jones was underwhelming, and then you had a couple of decent guys like Curtis Samuel and JuJu Smith-Schuster. You have a superstar in Cooper Kupp, a really good star in Chris Godwin, and then a weird one in Kenny Golladay who was up and down. Outside of that, everyone else flamed out, and the 2017 class will definitely go down as a disappointment. But what do you guys think? What do you think of the 2017 wide receiver class? Who was the biggest bust in this list? And what class or position breakdown should I do next? Be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen, including my video about the 2022 quarterback class. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.